There's so many places that we could go together, but I think I'll just kind of randomly pick a question that I had written out beforehand.
Yeah.
Um, would you would you be down to start talking about like your experience moving through the academy from the time you sort of first entered
Hmm.
into kind of where you are now, where I think my understanding is that you're doing some like associate teaching, but that it's with sort of a different perspective.
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, I don't think it's that interesting or it paints a very vivid narrative in any way. I mean, I kind of went to school because I just didn't know what else to do. Everyone was encouraging me to go to college. I wasn't quite sure about it for a brief moment there, but everyone was just saying, that's just what you do. Um, then I just decided to get a master's because it's only 2 more years. And then I was working for a while, for a couple years, and then the recession or the depression happened, the crash in 2009, and I was in Oregon with my wife, and she was getting her master's degree, and I just didn't really have a job. I had like some part-time gigs that paid very little and couldn't find a job, and basically I decided to go for a PhD because I didn't know what else to do. It was like, well, if I can get funded to do a PhD, at least that's like an income. So, I mean, there's more to it than that, of course. I've always, I think I'm more of a generalist than a specialist. So I've always kind of wanted to see the big picture, how things fit together. And so initially I settled on economics and then geography for my master's. So, kind of you know, a, an early or, an aspiring systems thinker, I guess. I didn't, have that language at the time. Then I went for a PhD in applied economics, looking at food systems, specifically in East Africa. It was a very interesting experience. On the one hand, applied economics at a land grant university, it kind of takes the framework, the assumptions of economics for granted, and it just wants to get a hold of some data and crunch some numbers and figure some stuff out. So there wasn't much kind of like epistemological or paradigmatic exploration. It's just kind of like these are the theories, these are the econometric models that you use, and then go get some data. It was nice because I had the opportunity to go to different countries in East Africa several times. My main focus of dissertation research was Tanzania, looking at post-farm food systems, but I also helped with a rural agricultural livelihood survey in Zambia my first summer, and I was in Mozambique as well for a summer. And, that was all very interesting. However, I mean, even before I started my PhD, I was kind of skeptical of economics. I was already aware of a lot of the critiques of economics. But I just decided, just go ahead and go into it, even being aware of, many of its shortcomings. And, on the one hand, it was just a very stressful experience. I wasn't fully in sync with my advisors. It ended up taking me 7 years to get the PhD. It was very stressful at times, all that stuff. But I also just started questioning, I was being trained to be a technocrat, basically. Maybe somebody working for USAID or Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, World Bank, something like that. Like that's the kind of job track that people, who graduated from there went towards. And I was always kind of unsure about whether the results we were presenting, not just me, but like everybody, whether they were the right questions, whether the data could be trusted, whether the models, even though, some of them were kind of sophisticated, whether you could take them seriously or not. And then even if you do have results that, one, aren't just common sense. Oftentimes the results are just common sense. If they're not common sense, then what is the chance that they're just not true, right? It's like something that nobody expected. Well, there's a high likelihood that, throughout some part of the process, something went wrong, and you're not actually getting this result. And then even if you do have a result that's not just common sense and it's very on solid foundations, then it goes to the political meat grinder, right? We don't live in a world where, oh, we just take the best policy and we apply it, and uh, you know, it depends on all of the politics involved with that. And then, of course, and then I think more after I finished my PhD, I started coming back. I had some of these proto ideas beforehand, but I started coming back to this, kind of being skeptical of the technocratic worldview anyway, of like, coming up with the best policies based on the best data and then implementing it, at like a national or international policy level. And so I started moving, psychologically in a more localist, organic, you could say, direction in how I think about things. And food systems, has always been a running theme throughout the whole process. So, that's where I got there. Now, I mean, so for, I followed my wife to Appalachian State University um, in Boone, North Carolina. We don't live in Boone, but we live near Boone. And I started teaching, just as an adjunct in her program. It's an interdisciplinary program called Sustainable Development. And that was really interesting because I got to just kind of, it was very flexible in what I can teach. And so this was around, probably a little bit before, but around the time we started doing more optimism. And I was just kind of thinking along, different lines and being influenced by many things outside of academia. And so I got to explore a lot of these ideas with students, which was really cool. But after a certain point, I realized that it probably wasn't in the cards in this context to get more of a stable kind of full-time position. So now in the last 6 months, I've been working, still kind of adjacent to academia. I'm still working at the university, but it's a non-faculty kind of research staff position, and it's in kind of the education field, I guess you could say. I could talk more about that if you're interested, but that's I don't know if that answers your question, but that's a broad overview.
Yeah, that it both felt like a lot, and I also made like 10 notes while you were talking about all those things, and immediately I was like, oh wow, like I immediately got curious about uh what was the nature of the work that you were doing in Tanzania and like in East Africa, like in terms of like you were talking about like models and like data, and I was wondering like what like the average day was in terms of like how, or like the methodology of like how were you were supposed to be getting information there, and to what end.
Yeah, surveys. So basically, you develop a survey, asking a series of questions. So, we are interviewing like different food system actors, and this was urban post farm. So, mainly in Dar es Salaam for my dissertation. Uh, and so basically, we wanted to know everything about their business, right? Like, where they got their raw inputs, how they process things. These are like food processors, like maize millers, things of that nature. Um, just asking as many questions you can about their operation, and then, you know, going in beforehand with a set of kind of research questions and hypotheses that you want to test. So it's not that much, it's not much more interesting than that, right? It was not, nothing what you would say qualitative about it, nothing participatory about it. So nothing, I guess, interesting in the sense that, I'd be really really proud to like show it off to all my alternative galaxy brain friends or anything.
Got you. And you had said that you had this sense like at some point that you were being trained to be a technocrat. Was there like an early clue, or like what were the clues along the way that you're like, I feel like I know sort of where this is all directed from an outside influence?
Yeah, I mean, it was just really clear. The people who graduated from the program where they got jobs, were institutions, like the World Bank, for example, right? And the World Bank, is in some ways infamous. It's been involved in some shady things, throughout the decades. But they've also arguably done some good things. But they're the kind of the world, the international kind of leading kind of developmental organization, right? And that was kind of like for a lot of my classmates and colleagues, like like that's a big deal if you get into the World Bank kind of thing, or USAID, right? That's like the U.S. United States kind of development organization. Or it's depending on your field, or something more regional, maybe. So there's several, but those are kind of like, that gives you an idea, hopefully, of where people go, or they go into academia. They try and get a tenure track position or something like that. So it was just very clear. Talking with people, what they aspire to, and and I think maybe a common thread, characteristic of all these organizations is that I don't know if there's a better word to describe it besides technocratic, right? It's, people collecting information, large, data sets, crunching numbers and proposing policy based on the results. And then, if you're successful or lucky, then maybe it gets implemented by some organization and you quote unquote make a difference. That's kind of the mindset or the worldview of it.
So there's this loop from information to crunching to like modeling, then into policy, and then like some sort of like now we measure the results to like we start a new round of information collecting.
I think that's the ideal. A lot of times, the information gets collected. The policy prescriptions get made, and then nothing happens with it. Like nobody takes it up, or if it does get taken up, the results of it aren't measured. And that's a problem that's people in that field are aware of. It happens all the time, and so the more diligent among them would try and follow up and see if if this program is making a difference, or somebody else will do it, and that'll be their research paper or dissertation. But a lot of things fall through the cracks. Yeah.
This really puts my mind on I'm coming to all this as like a super noob, I would say, in the sense of like what it's bringing to mind is this curiosity about the theme of like policy and like what does policy mean to different people in the world, and like uh, to what extent is like should we think about policy as we think about like any other like aspect of our lives, and I think what I'm really getting at is that like through doomer optimism, I've kind of thought a lot more about like maybe I don't want to look at like national policy as much as I want to look at like local policy, but then I also want to look at like, well, what is it when people just make choices and they change the world, but it doesn't happen through policy? Is that still policy? Is that implicit policy?
That's one way maybe you can frame it. I don't know if it does anything for us to frame it that way. That's a very interesting question. So there's the issue of scale, right? And the issue of scale really became kind of prominent in my mind a few years ago after I'd kind of left that world. And so when we think about kind of like what happens in a county scale or neighborhood or town, that's something where you have pretty immediate feedback, right? It's something like you can make a difference at the county scale. Almost anybody can, right? It's hard, it'd be hard pressed to find somebody who would deny that, if particular capable person or organization or group can make a big difference at a county scale or even at a town scale, for the issues that they care about. And it's situated, it's local, right? There is this feedback. It's embodied. It's more embodied. It's more direct. You're in the water. It's the water that you're swimming in. Once you start getting into larger scales, let's say a national scale, it becomes very different, right? And so, you know, the worldview I think of the technocrat is that, well, there's many problems in the world that can only happen at larger scales. They can only happen at the national or international scale, and so we need national and international solutions. But uh, you know, the fact that nobody can really know intimately a nation, right, or especially a nation like the United States or the world, and really understand kind of the context of the lives that people live and how certain ideas might affect their lives if you have no idea what their lives are like, or even the context in which they live, or their surroundings, their ecology. The challenge, and I think the argument against the technocratic worldview, is that most of the proposals that you're going to make, even if it's quote unquote with the best data and with the best models and stuff, are probably not going to be that helpful, and are quite possibly going to be harmful, because it doesn't spring out of the daily lives of people and the needs that that they perceive, and the capacities that they feel, their affordances, based on this feedback with their community and with their environment. So, that's the tension, though, because there are larger scale issues. There's ecological, there's various ecological climate issues that are larger scale than than say a town or a county. Many, whether it happens to be like nuclear nonproliferation, or artificial intelligence, or bioweapons potentially, or something, right? There's all of these issues that you can't really address at your neighborhood scale, but might still affect you. And so I understand where the kind of point of view is coming from, that you need this kind of higher powered solution, but like, I don't know if there's a good answer, right? I these days I lean more towards kind of a more cosmo-local, I would call, point of view, where you focus a lot at your local scale, but you try and network with other localities and exchange learning and information, and so you have kind of a networked model of or like a broad scale change model instead of a large scale change. And the difference there is that, to me, broad scale is most of the things being implemented are being implemented at a smaller scale, but the information and best practices and these things are being exchanged across these nodes. And I don't know if this kind of I think of it as an alternative model will be successful or viable. It's only really been possible, I think, with the internet. But I think to me it has it's more promising than our current national technocratic operations, and international technocratic operations.
This is changing gears a bit, but I have a question written down that says, to what extent would removing conversational terms like the left and the right be generative in society?
Well, I mean, that's a perennial question, right? Something we talked a lot about, especially at the beginning of Doomer Optimism, is we're kind of noticing, Ashley and I were having a lot of conversations about, there's a lot of things that the left, people who identify as left or right might agree upon, especially having to do with, say, conservation, right, or ecological health, or local food. And so, maybe we can like discover a different axis, right? Maybe there's a whole different axis where these different polarized camps can collaborate with each other. I think over time we realize the difficulty of that, because even if especially on something like on social media like Twitter or something, even though you're starting to kind of have conversations with people very different from you normally on things that you both care about, you care about them for very different reasons oftentimes, and the cultural issues really never go away and they flare up. And so, I think I've become more skeptical of abandoning notions of left and right, uh, because the cultural issues, they do matter. And, you know, uh, I'm not really sure how you get around that on the internet in particular. You know, local communities, I think it's easier actually, right? A lot of times, I'm thinking about, say I'm going to my local general store, right? And, or I'm selling something at a local market, we're not really talking about our politics, but we're still kind of collaborating in a mutually beneficial way that, on things that we care about. And so, focusing, I think, smaller scale and on practical stuff, you can kind of get around the polarization, the political polarization, for things that really matter. But that doesn't mean that you're going to iron out, these kind of really uh, fundamental differences. I just don't, I just don't know if that's possible. I don't know. I'm curious. I'm curious about what you think.
Oh, about left and right, like
Yeah, yeah. How would you answer your question?
so. I think I think that there's like a lot of playfulness like internally with my own question asking where I see how there's a kind of like childlike naivety about like, oh, we'll just, do away with these terms. And there's a kind of like ultra simplicity in kind of how I've like framed the question, but for me, I think it's like a launch pad around like how can we be conscientious language users, and like to what extent are we like uh I guess I was gonna say like designing reality, but that's not the right word I want. It's more like how are we reflecting reality with words. And I think what it makes me wonder about is like, does like thoughtful language use, like is there some way to take that question seriously about like what the words that you use, how do they then reflect like in the lives of people around you, and when is it worthwhile to kind of make like probably my favorite like partner question to this question is this idea about what if we could make like a new universal language that wasn't English? Because like English has this kind of very fraught past, and it's not really about, I think, the inclusivity of like pluralism. And so it's so so if I back up and say how would I answer my question, it would be like wondering, are words always going to like, are they always going to be able to be used like in ways that are like generative or detracting? And I'm coming at it from kind of a point where if I hear the word left like in when somebody's talking, like I don't know if we're all talking about like the same left, and because it's used so kind of like quickly, I oftentimes wonder like what, I want to do like a sample survey of 10,000 people of like what does the word left mean to you, and just kind of track like the spread on that. And maybe that's just a way of highlighting how little I know about like political terminology. Whereas when whereas you're talking about like kind of like highlighting big cultural differences, and I was wondering in my head what an example of that would be. And the one that came to mind was like, oh, there's a lot of sort of there's differing views on like abortion. And so I was like, there, it's like very clear to me because then like the language is specific in a way that like left and right feel like negatively ambiguous. Um, so I guess the way to wrap up my answer is to say I think I would just try for myself like, well, what if I just eliminate that from my vocabulary temporarily for 6 months? Like what happens? And to try and ask 100 people like what they think about that question and see how they kind of like riff on it.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, the approach we've taken with the podcast is, we invite a pretty broad ideological spectrum of people on. Usually, there's some kind of common ground of things that we're interested in and they're interested in. And these are some of the things I mentioned earlier, uh, having to do with, say, local food. I think is, you know, a really good example. Um, but other things as well. And we invite a pretty broad ideological spectrum. We've invited, I'd say, pretty radical leftists. We've invited pretty radical reactionaries on the other side, and we've gotten a lot of heat sometimes for who we choose to platform, right? Because there's a whole conversation about like, even platforming somebody is violence or something, and we've kind of resisted that. For us, the importance of having good conversations and really trying to figure out where we can connect is the most important thing. And so most of our interviews we don't even bring in that kind of terminology. I try to avoid it, unless it's more of like a meta commentary like we're talking about now. We don't bring people on and say, hey, what do you think about the left, or what does that mean to you? Like, for us, or I guess just for me, that hasn't really been a generative question. It's just getting more into like, what are we really interested in, and can we explore, kind of this landscape of experience and ideas. Um, and I personally, I'm not saying this. I don't know if this is necessarily a better way to do it, but I personally try to avoid just kind of triggering language in general. I'm pretty aware of what language is triggering to whom. I guess that's just being kind of Twitter brained for so long. Which has, I guess, some upsides, a lot of downsides, but some upsides. And so I try to frame things in a way that is still trying to getting at what I want to talk about, but is avoiding these unnecessary triggers. And that's kind of how I try and communicate in general, even on social media. And I usually find that it works pretty well. I'm able to kind of talk with, again, people from all over that ideological spectrum. Certainly, people who wouldn't talk to each other, or if they were in the same room together, it would immediately blow up into something. And Ashley has the same approach, and so do the other hosts on Doomer Optimism, I think. So I think that's really been our niche. Is we're interested in the big issues that other podcasts are interested in. I know you and actually talked about like the Great Simplification with Nate Hagens and shows like that, which are great. But I think our kind of specialty is trying to like Hagen's interviews a lot of like experts, right? Like world experts on so and so, and we have some of those people. We occasionally get like this big fish who's world renowned expert or just very knowledgeable in a certain field, but more often we just get normal people who have something to say, have an interesting perspective, whether we necessarily agree with it or not. And we're just wanting to kind of explore where that headspace is at, and how that's informed by their experiences. And um, and I think, yeah, I mean, I think that's, if I were to say the value added of Doomer Optimism, I'd say that would be it.
Huh. And I think that it's fascinating that sort of that you've taken that approach because like I guess it makes me want to ask the follow-up question of like, oh, so if you get a big fish to use that term, like the goal is not to then necessarily like get bigger and bigger fish, or to get to a place of like concentrated sort of experts. And I guess that it makes me wonder about like, okay, what is it that you can get from having the conversations with the normies,
Well, I wouldn't necessarily call them normies. They're quite weird oftentimes. Like we're all pretty weird. You know,
yeah.
just having these kinds of conversations makes you a weirdo. But
Does
the
it?
everyday weirdo, let's just say,
Okay.
the everyman's weirdo.
Okay. What is the everyman's weirdo, or who is the everyman's weirdo?
Uh, well, I'd say anybody who's pretty active on Twitter or something like Twitter, who say has over 1,000 followers, or is just chronically you know kind of interested in these kind of niche subcultural conversations. Even if you're in your daily life you have a normal job and everything else pretty normal, you're still pretty weird. I think most people aren't being exposed to these kinds of memes and conversations. So I'd say one criteria. Well, there's some people who are just there's always been those people that are kind of eccentric in society, and so that's not new. But I'd say the modern or the meta modern everyday weirdo is people who are on platforms like Twitter and are still kind of part of normal life.
Got you.
Yeah.
Speaking of metamodernity, I have a question here that says, "Explain to me like I'm five, metamodernity, modernity, postmodernity," and then in the parenthetical, in the form of TV shows. And that that's kind of a reference to I did try to read Jonathan Rawson's like paper from one of that he had mentioned, and I really struggled with it.
Yeah, Brendan, the person who probably talks about metamodernism the most clearly and in kind of very clear language is Brendan Graham Dempsey, and we had him on a few episodes ago, Metamodern Permaculture, which I think if people are interested in that term, check that out. Like we're applying it to something specific to permaculture, but he defines what metamodernity or metamodernism is as well. Um, so I wouldn't, I'm not really the best qualified to, to really explain it, I don't think. But I think the simplest explanation, it's kind of this observation that, so, we've seen kind of different historical eras, different historical epochs. There's clearly kind of a difference between, and people define the dates different ways. But if you say something like that's pre-modern versus modern, usually people have a sense of what that means, right? When modernity started, was it the scientific revolution? Was it the industrial revolution? Was it after World War II? Like people can define in different ways, and hundreds of books can be written about just those definitions. So then you get into modernity, and so okay, modernity, modern medicine, antibiotics, you know, the internet, or computers or the TV. So that's, I think that's pretty intuitive to most people. And then, when you're talking about postmodernism or postmodernity, you can also point to like, okay, what were the 60s all about, right? What was this whole thing of like people starting to protest the military industrial complex, right? Or suddenly people were critiquing, the government in a way that hadn't really happened before. And people were starting to, critiquing modern gender roles or critiquing, all of these things. There's like this culture of critique, right? Of like deconstructing the grand narrative of modernity that, science and, and maybe some kind of civic religion or, mainline Protestantism or something, I think you can maybe associate with modernity, and it's amenable to kind of like technology and science. That combination, starting to just deconstruct all of these things. It happened in the arts. You could even say like the Beat generation in the 50s in America were like maybe, one of the early forerunners of this. And then you get everything that comes after that. So you get kind of this post-modernity, which I think people kind of say peaked in like the 90s, right? And kind of the climax of postmodernity is basically nihilism and cynicism, because you're deconstructing, but like, okay, we've seen all of the flaws in modernity, but we still have to have something to get us up in the morning, to give meaning and value to our lives. And so what's that? And so metamodernity is kind of just like, postmodernity. It's like, well, what happens after postmodernity, right? Like, where does that leave us? Where everything is just perspective. There's no kind of transcendental truths anymore because they've all been deconstructed. So then what's next? Does that just lead to madness? You get the internet coming online in the 90s as well, and this kind of even accelerates the rise of just multi-perspectivalism, just all of these different information feeds and people starting to move into their own reality tunnels more and more. And so metamodernity is kind of, it's the term started being used in the arts and culture specifically, of like starting to see a turn in the culture, moving from something like Seinfeld in the 90s or The Simpsons, which was, funny, entertaining to watch, but, Seinfeld is really like there's not really any there, right? There's not like you're not getting warm and fuzzies from watching Seinfeld. And so it's like, well, we're starting to see this turn in the arts and culture where suddenly shows are starting to, tentatively move towards meaning again, and move towards emotional kind of resonance again, right? And everything is suddenly, there's certain shows or musicians that aren't just, break down the system, right? That aren't just kind of cynical, like they're starting to express real emotion, but they're doing it with a certain awareness that postmodernity has happened, right? So they're carrying the knowledge of postmodernity with them, the critique of modernity, but then they're realizing that, that you can't throw all of modernity out with the bathwater, right? To even suggest as such is just ridiculous. Like, we're all completely reliant on modernity and, all of the technologies, physical and social, to live our lives at this point. And so, it's starting to, so there's a great website in set of people called What is Metamodern, where they basically go through different shows like in popular culture and talk about this show is metamodern and this is why, and this show is not metamodern and this is why. We actually interviewed them a long time ago, or like 3 years ago, on the Both And podcast before Doom or Optimism. If people want to check that out. And then it started, people, started picking up on that and saying, well, we can move this beyond culture. What about if we think about culture and society and politics? And if we don't just look at it descriptively, like this is just what's naturally happening, but also, prescriptively, can we think about moving beyond modernity and postmodernity, but taking kind of the best of each sensibility and creating something new, and something that's both not naive and both aware of critiques of grand narratives, but still realizes the importance of grand narratives, and tries to construct them on that basis. And so that really started happening in like the mid 2010s. The Hansi Freinock book, Listening Society and Nordic Ideology were pretty influential, and then you get a whole ecosystem around that. A lot of them start incorporating complexity science and complexity thinking into that, and you start getting this whole ecosystem. And there's certain terms I could use that people might be familiar with, whether it's like Game B or the Dark Enlightenment, or there's just all of these kind of little sub scenes that arose And a lot of, what we've referred to as galaxy brain, are associated with that. And my earlier podcast, both and, we were definitely kind of trying to riff or ride on that wave and kind of explore, topics and guests from that point of view as well.
I'm looking over some of the notes that I wrote while you were giving that taking us on the tour through the lands of the modern, the postmodern, and the metamodern. I loved it. Um, it um, you had you had mentioned system science and galaxy brain, and it made me wonder, like, do you think that there was like a person like a prototypical system scientist in like human societies throughout like all of the time that there have been humans?
Yeah, I would say so. Not in the specific kind of mental models and tools and but I'd say that there's always been people who are more of a generalist than a specialist, and kind of thought and tended towards the more abstract, towards abstraction, and what does this all mean, right? So whether that was in earlier societies, whether that was like the priest or the shaman or something, or even like the advisor to the king, right? The who kind of were tasked with trying to see the bigger picture. Um, I think even early evolutionary history, it makes sense that there would be people who were particularly good at the day to day tasks, and then there were some people who were more inclined to like, okay, but what's the larger context that we're in? Because that's really important. Like we can be building our village here, but if we're about to get attacked by a neighboring village, then it's all for naught. And so, like, what are the kind of the signs and you know, um, like what is this larger context that we're in that might inform our day to day? And so, I think it's always been with us, but it's just taken different forms.
Hmm. Do you think that other animals like do this to us like a certain degree? Like, do you think whales are have some systems thinkers?
I have no idea. I don't know. What do you think? I just have no idea how to answer that question. I don't know.
I mean, like it's ridiculous, but like I'm also yeah, I was like I would love to, maybe with this whole natural language processing that they're trying to do with like making a whale alphabet,
Right, right.
that there'll be a chance to to ask some whales, but
Uh-huh.
I like certainly there's like specialization within like organisms like bees, or any other organism. So I think it's more like me being curious about like how does like language inform like systems thinking,
Yeah.
and trying to kind of get at that in a playful way.
Yeah. I mean, I think a good indicator of that, just off the top of my mind, is like some kind of measure of metacognition. So, like, not just cognition about the task at hand, but kind of cognition about how are we thinking about this, right? Is there a different kind of way to look at this? Just that kind of ability that you know seems is pretty strong in humans, and might there might be signs of it in other animals. I think that's how, if I was doing trying to do some kind of study like that with natural language processing, that's probably where I would go first.
Got you. uh, I was just imagining doing a segment about like how how should people go about doing research, um, kind of in the broadest level, but in in the specifics of like the different kind of like fields that you've explored.
Yeah. Well, so I mean, the last few years, like I've changed how I've thought about these things quite a bit. Going both from kind of a big picture policy technocratic perspective in my education, and then kind of near the end of that, starting to get into these kind of alternative big picture kind of conversations that many of them rejected the technocratic worldview that I was a part of, and that was certainly a big part of me kind of drifting away from it. But they still kind of, even these alternative ones, my critique at the time before starting Doomer Optimism and after the last podcast ended was that it was too abstract and theoretical, and there wasn't enough kind of embodiment in these conversations. And some people respond to that with, more on the kind of the spiritual side of it is like, oh, let's do embodiment practices, right? And so that became kind of programmatic in that way. But, and that was something that I was always interested in as well. I was always interested in this notion of embodied cognition. And I was, really into meditation for a while, and I was exploring that a lot. But in terms of like how it actually gets applied to the world, it has to, I just drifted more and more towards it has to be physical, it has to be embodied, it has to be situated, it has to be tangible. And so, that really moved me in the direction towards, more kind of a localist sensibility, I guess. And so the research, the research program there, it's not really, it's I would say that it's done more in the style of iteration, where you experiment with things, you try things, you iterate, you get feedback, you're attuned to your body and your environment, and so you're good at receiving that feedback, and you start getting a better idea of how something works through iterated experimentation, and sharing that with others as well. And that's a different approach than, say, the modern policy wonk, who is often most of the time disconnected from their area of research, or if not disconnected, they're not really that embedded into it. Some are, but that's pretty rare. And they collect data, and that's just kind of like what they think, what they're kind of imposing, on that situation is like, this is the important thing to measure, right? So they're making assumptions about what is important to measure, and then what are the conclusions based on those measurements, right? And so that's a very different, that's just a very different way of looking at it. And so I was just moving towards research as being, hands in the dirt, basically. That led me to, with my family, to buy a few acres of land to start, trying to develop a kind of a homestead or a hobby farm type thing. It led me to be just much more interested in, just the importance of local community. And then, the podcast element is, well, they can't just be that either. You do need this larger context. And so having conversations across communities was really, the idea I had about doomer optimism is we can all be doing these little experiments in our backyards, so to speak, and then we can be sharing our experiments with others, and maybe we'll get some insight from somebody else's experiment that we can apply in our own context, in an adapted form. But it was really a kind of a horizontal exchange of information instead of a top-down information gathering and then policy, prescribing approach.
Are there experiments like in the region of Appalachia that you are like watching, or like kind of watching or following, that have just kind of, that you do as like a matter of just sort of like learning about the region there, and
Yeah.
kind of they inform your kind of sense of experimentation.
Yeah, one that immediately comes to mind is we've had a few conversations on this on food hubs, and you and Ashley kind of talked about a similar concept about kind of local food aggregators, so to speak. And when I was listening to that, it was funny. When I was listening to that, I was just like, I was like, say the word, right? It's like we've had podcasts about it. Come on, guys. Um, uh, but basically, there's, and it's actually a, kind of an old model. It's just kind of a, food hub is really just any kind of, a community, finding a way to kind of, aggregate its food for more, efficient distribution. That's really all it is. And so that's been happening for a long time. But there's kind of a new form that involves, for example, the internet, many food hubs have websites, and you can order your food online on a certain day, and then you pick it up on another day. That order goes to the farmers. They know what they need to bring for that week, and so that's an affordance that's new, for example. And there's like a dozen of them now in here in Western North Carolina in various capacities. And they're all, within they came about within the last 10 years or so. And so that's a very interesting thing. And then there was a recent podcast was, the guy who I interviewed who runs a food hub about an hour and a half away from me. And then three people from Oregon and California who were also starting similar things. And they had a conversation about kind of their comparative experiences and challenges and, things of that nature. And so this is, to me, this kind of conversation and movement is kind of, really a good example of when I think of this idea of cosmo-localism, because, food hubs are very local. They involve local customers, local farmers. They're using, modern technology to make it happen. And these conversations across food hubs and across regions in very different contexts, and often which take very different forms, those conversations are starting to happen as well. And so, yeah, that's one example that came to mind.
That for anyone listening, that was episode 226. That was the roundtable with don't have their names offhand, but four or five folks. That I listened to that episode not too long ago, and it was, I mean, it was fascinating because it was like something that's not really on my radar at all, at least like the amount of depth that they were going into about sort of like the nitty-gritty details of like talking about processing 10,000 heads of cabbage and just sort of getting a sense of like the scale that the food hub kind of occupies. This is a kind of a tangential question or parallel question, but like, how if you like try and go do all your shopping at the farmer's market, it's very expensive.
Definitely. Absolutely.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's it. That's the question. So, as someone who doesn't really understand like fully how foods hubs are integrated into this sort of whole food system world, do you see food hubs as like sort of being able to be like a happy Goldilocks zone of like affordability and sort of better respect for farmers and what farmers go through to do their to bring food to people?
I think that they're trying to make that happen, right? As they mentioned in that episode, treating farmers well is might be the highest priority. Making sure that farmers get paid and they can make a living. And then, of course, affordability. That gets into questions of equity and all of these things. That's a obviously a big component too. So it's just a fact of the matter that a food hub in Appalachia probably will never be able to compete on price with Walmart, right? You know, economies of scale are real. You know, externalities that you don't get accounted for are real. And, you know, I mean, this can, I'm tempted to go into a much larger conversation about the food system, but you know, we've had conversations about
Yes.
this, but, I don't think under the current political economy, you know, I think food hubs will always be marginal to the culture. I don't think they'll ever get that big, or, you know, really provide more than, say, you know, 10% at most of the food in a certain region. And I just think that, you know, it's like there's only so much you can do in the current political economy. On the other hand, you know, I don't expect, we've had lots of conversations about this, you know, for a variety of reasons, we don't really expect the current political economy to be sustainable, right? We don't think it's going to last. So then the question is, well, you know, how can we think of food hubs as kind of a transitional institution that, you know, this is the time where we can build up its institutional capacity so that when they start becoming much more essential for local food security, that they're ready to really fill up that niche, right? So that's how I think of food hubs, and how, you know, if I was a director of a food hub, that's how I would probably be thinking about it. You know, and what would cause that? I mean, I'm curious of what, you know, all of the kind of the different variants of doom. You know, which ones do you think about? Like, you know, we've talked a lot about, you know, about a lot of them on the podcast, but, you know, what's most relevant to you?
Wow. I think social contract is the first like phrase that comes into my head, but I sort of want to like be patient with my thoughts as they're percolating. Um, I think probably something along the lines of like two or three intersecting events that together could like just kind of cause people to really get like freaked out in a way, like two or three events that would really, like, let's say that there was like we have inflation going on right now. We have and we have sort of this issue with like energy prices kind of going crazy. Like energy man seems to kind of only go up. And so I think about like maybe just in, I don't know, however many years, like I actually don't want to put it in that context of like trying to put it on a timeline, but there's a way in which I imagine like, oh, all you have to do is just like make, you know, gas go to like $10, to like really all of a sudden just see like everything become disrupted, to where like all of the existing, um, I'm thinking about like, okay, you've like, oh, if this happened in like the Bay Area, like, oh, would you then get like, you know, four times as many amount of homeless people? Um, would you then start having like more riots? And then could you get to like kind of things like, oh, are we going to start doing like more serious policing? So I think to kind of back up and try and answer that, I think like energy and transportation, like probably make me, I think about those the most because they're just yeah, they just, I don't know, that's where they occupy
Right.
my brain.
Yeah. Well, and let's apply those two things to the food system, right? So, you know, even local food is not immune from this, right? Of transportation, like food hubs have trucks, right? Many farmers, certainly, industrial farmers, but even local farmers, use petroleum products. They use plastics. They use, uh, various things. Of course, when you're looking at tractor use and diesel fuel, that's tied to energy. Fertilizers, if you're not organic, pesticides, those fertilizers are the Haber-Bosch processes derived from natural gas, or that's an input into the process. And so you can start seeing, it can start just spiraling out really quickly of, oh, wow, right? Like you start showing up to the supermarket and the shelves are bare, or, you know, food has doubled, tripled, quadrupled in price because of energy costs that just kind of ripple out through the system. That's a very scary prospect. And it's something that I would hope would never happen. I would hope that, I think for me, if our assessment of the situation, both kind of ecology, climate, energy, and politics and culture are more or less correct, and that we're going through a real transitionary phase here, I would hope that it would be kind of a stair step process where there's no shocks that are so large that just cause, complete social disruption, and it just spirals, out of control further and further, right? So if the biophysical tensions, if they trigger the social tensions and create just all out social chaos and war and violence, well, I don't know how much chance, any of us have to do much of anything, right? But if they're not so severe all at once, but they are definitely signaling to us that, hey, this way we're doing things is not going to work. We have to try a different way. That's a much more optimistic scenario in my view, and it's something that I think most of us who are in this realm, unless you're an all-out just prepper off grid, in your bunker, like that's what you better hope for.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to like psychologically try and like prepare for something like all out
Right.
chaos because you're like, well, I don't really want to do that because that sounds like everything's up in the air. Like,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, it is. And I don't think anybody is immune to that. I don't care if you live out on a, quote unquote self sufficient homestead way out in the middle of nowhere. You still probably drive your truck. You still probably, go to Walmart once a month to get some essential supplies. You're still reliant on the monopoly of violence of the state. Maybe the state is, one of your threats in your mind, or in reality. But there's a lot of things about modern society that I think we take for granted, in terms of keeping social order. However unjust it is for many marginalized groups of people at certain times, certain places. It's not. For the most part, we don't live in all out violent anarchy.
um, I I'm kind of making a mental bookmark about just to to learn more about food hubs and just to be able to, I don't know, imagining a future conversation where we would kind of go down the rabbit hole further on that.
Yeah, if we were to do that, I would love to bring in others who are, like my friend down at this, food hub in Spruce Pine, who knows a lot more about than I do.
Yeah, that's cool. I have a question here that says, for how long have we had all the information we need to know we need to make different choices? And then it's followed up with, should we just stop doing the IPCC panel?
Oh man, these are out of left field. Well, that's such a broad. The first one is such a broad question. All the information that who's we? What
Okay.
information about what?
s- Okay, so I'll say like we meaning scientists have known since like right like the 50s that like global warming was like pretty I don't know that it would like lead to some pretty serious like
Well, a few
effects.
people knew.
Um,
Other people were talking about global cooling. They're worried about the next ice age coming. Um, I would say the 80s was really when global warming
okay.
became kind of more of a, even just a broad scale conversation among scientists, let alone, the public talking about it. That's just my perspective. I could be wrong. I mean, there was people, in the early 1900s, maybe late 1800s, who were like, we're talking about, you know, global warming, the greenhouse effect, but it was like one dude, right? Or like a few dudes talking,
Hmm.
in their, in their homes, and in niche press outlets.
Oh, okay. So we'll say the 80s for the particular subset of uh like clear knowledge that releasing crazy amounts of emissions like would have some impacts, um or like people who have been like studying insect
Right.
loss for I don't know however long. It feels like let's say if we just take the 80s, like we've had then 40 years of like pretty good information about like the trend of society, like of what do you want to call like modernity,
Yeah.
industrialization,
Yeah.
growthism. A lot of people like I think speaking out about it like regularly, maybe not being heard. It doesn't seem to be implemented in policy in any serious
Right.
way. I apologize if that's just very like sort of cynical
Mm.
sounding.
No, I think that's about right.
But it. I mean, it doesn't seem like the. I'm kind of coming to this whole conversation with like it doesn't seem like a lack of information has been the problem for a long time. If you're kind of taking the stance that like we like as a way of living, we can't just kind of go on with the status quo. Um, and so, what does that mean about like the production of like information now? If like the information that we already have is not necessarily like being implemented in a way that sort of takes the information we do have
Yeah.
seriously.
Well, I think there's a couple things. One, we don't really have an epistemological commons. And what I mean by that is a lot of people are very distrustful of science, trademark TM, scientists, government agencies, or they take, their kind of, data and predictions seriously, but they don't trust this information in the hands of the government, right? Or various actors who will pursue some other ideological agenda in the name of, like you see this a lot with climate change. Like there's a whole spectrum of where people stand on that, right? There's like people who are just outright, don't believe, deny that anthropogenic climate change is real, or the next level they do, but it's not a big deal. Things are going to get greener. It's going to get warmer. It's we're going to go to the beach more or something. Or they do see it as a problem, but they don't see a technocratic fix for it, right? Or they balance that with, well, they maybe rightly acknowledge that we don't, since the industrial revolution and up until now, we don't really know how to live otherwise. We don't really know how to conduct our society in a way that wouldn't just lead to complete collapse of society, right? If we suddenly were to overnight curb emissions by 80%, that would basically mean curbing energy use by 80%, right? Like we have no idea what the ripple effects of the economy would be, but most likely it would lead to widespread famine, social conflict, chaos, war, all of these things, right? So then there's like, well, it is real, it is serious, but the way that people are proposing to approach it is not really, not really fit for the task. And I think that's where doomer optimism probably lands, right? Like we're not, we're definitely critical of the IPCC set, right? I personally, I take the science very seriously. I think, of course, like all science, there's problems. Any kind of forecasting is inherently problematic. There's inherent uncertainty in, very complex systems. But I think the trend lines in general of, ecological degradation, species loss, loss of kind of ecological integrity and biodiversity, increasing kind of not just warming, on the whole, but, weirding, right, of just climate, variability due to the effect of, the poles warming up faster than the equator, leading to all these weird effects with the jet stream and other things. And then you can look at kind of the framework of planetary limits, right, by the Stockholm Institute. They have 9, what they define as like 9 planetary limits having to do with fresh water and ocean acidification and all of these things, right? I think that's all, if not in every detail in the general zeitgeist, something to take very seriously. But I'm not sure. I mean, what people have been trying to do is have these global agreements to address these things. And as we've seen for the last how many years, how many decades, like 30 years now, countries are just, not following through. If the United States and China doesn't go with it, then the other countries are, less likely to go with it as well, because it'll just be to their disadvantage. It worked once, the Montreal Accord, I think in the 90s for CFCs for the ozone layer. Like they made an agreement to phase those out, and it actually happened, and they basically were phased out. So it's not like international agreement is impossible, but that was a very easy thing to fix. There was a readily available alternative. But with much more difficult things where countries would take a significant, it would take a significant hit, and, the politics involved make it almost impossible because, politicians don't want to do things that, will get them hung in the town square, right? And then, the multipolar trap dynamics, right? Where if, if you're a leader and you think that the country should pursue some policy, but that this other big country, your competitor, is not going to pursue that policy. Well, if you don't, if you do it, you're going to be at a severe disadvantage, right? And that country is going to develop much faster militarily, technologically, and perhaps perhaps destroy you or take you over. So this multipolar trap dynamic is a big, I think, headwind there. And so I'm not optimistic that, we're going to come to an international agreement that everyone's going to agree to make realistic policy changes that don't just, that actually have a real effect, that don't just cause the collapse of the system. And so then, what's the alternative? Well, I don't know, is the first answer, but the second answer is, well, let's try to, at the scale that we feel a sense of agency, let's try to create a more resilient and regenerative way of life that, we can share with as many people as possible. That seems to me to be the only alternative, especially for just, your normal person who is not part of these high stakes you're not a international diplomat. You're not a policymaker. You're just a regular person. What do you do? Well, there's lots of things you can do to make your household, your community, your county, your watershed, healthier and more resilient. And yeah, I mean, it's not a really great answer, but yeah, I'm curious. Yeah, if you have thoughts on, do you agree with that framing of like these are the kind of the this is the I don't know, the challenge of it all.
I think on the whole, yes, I I see it like that basically we've like set something into motion, and the thing into motion now has all these different symptoms that are these let's say these nine planetary boundaries. It could be an arbitrary number, but these the markers. So yes, I've got that framework. I don't know what would be different now that was, between now and when like we tried to do the Paris Accords, like whenever that was in the 2000s, and or any other kind of time that there's tried to be like international agreement. I think going back to what you said about scale, I don't know like if there's some sort of number, but it does seem like there's something about, if you just take a country like America and 300, whatever million people, you're like, wow, it's really hard to do policy on that level for a whole country. Um, so, so yes, I think I would take the the broad like analysis. I'm in the same camp of like I think it is about like local experimentation, and having some way to like speak to other people, like having some kind of language to speak about kind of like your framework for making local decisions. It What came to mind is like, oh, should we all just do living energy
Hmm.
farms style?
Yeah.
Should we be all going walking around? I'm in Berkeley. Should I be going to the mayor and saying, hey, how can we do living energy farms for
Yeah.
Berkeley, and just kind of the absurdity sounding of
Hmm.
that. But um, I go ahead.
Yeah. This kind of relates to something I said before. I'm not optimistic that, again, in the current political economy, we're going to take these interesting case studies, these proofs of concept, and get a large municipality, for example, to really implement it, in a kind of a dramatic way. Around the edges, there are. So, for example, my county extension agency, they're pretty good. They work with conventional farmers. They work with alternative farmers. One of the guys in the extension is, really into permaculture. He's come over to my place a couple times to kind of give me some advice on stuff. And so, within a lot of these large bureaucratic organizations, there are people who are starting to become aware of a lot of these examples and alternative ways of doing things. And so I guess maybe I'm almost trying I'm convincing myself that there is hope through institutional change. Uh, I think there's a lot of countervailing forces as well of like just the status quo, not just kind of psychologically, but just kind of materially. Um, is often very hard to overcome. Like living energy farms is a really fascinating example, but it's also very small scale, right? Like that's San Francisco trying to implement direct what is it, direct DC power, just in time for various things. Like that wouldn't happen in kind of like a pen stroke, right? Like that would, like maybe they would encourage kind of local neighborhood experimentation or like innovation hubs to do that, and I think that would be probably the way to go. And so I think overall, just the more experiments and these alternative ways of doing things, the better, right? Not that they're gonna become the new mainstream anytime soon, but you're building the capacity of what comes next, so that when conditions change, suddenly the cost benefit of moving in that direction becomes much more salient to much more people.
Damn, that is sounds realistic, but also very bubble bursting about, come on, everybody,
Yeah,
let's just, collapse early or whatever you
right.
want to call it. Let's just do the hard thing
Yeah, I
now.
don't think most people are going to collapse early, but I think that we can hope that enough people collapse early that they're able to. I once had an idea of like, we're not trying to get everybody on one ship. We're trying to build lifeboats, but we're trying to build, like, a billion 8-person lifeboats, right? And so the more people experimenting with this stuff, that's just knowledge that's being created that might actually be appreciated at some point, and might actually be scaled out, dramatically once people's mainstream lifestyles are disrupted to such a degree that it's no longer comfortable and they're looking for something else.
Mamma mia.
Yeah.
I got for to round things off, I've got like just kind of a field of questions that I want to invite you to sort of respond to however it feels right to you. But it's who has touched your soul, who has touched your heart, and where do you feel most connection to both like darkness and light?
Who has touched my soul? My kids. Uh, my kids have touched my soul and my heart. Trying to, the first thought that like I got to figure out is like something that I've read or watched or something of that nature. But I think it all comes down to personal relationships, that I've had or I've had. Um, you know, uh, my wife, my parents, my certain really close friends throughout the years. I don't know if that's the kind of if you're looking for a different kind of answer than that. Um, there's certainly like people I listen to or movies that I watch that kind of get me close to that. I can't funnily enough, nothing is like immediately coming to mind. I'm sure after this call, like 10 examples will come up. Um, what was the last part about darkness?
Where do you feel most connection to both darkness and light?
Darkness, I think, is just the existential question that we all live with, around death and around, I don't know, intuitions of what is like what is hell, what is the karmic cycle, what is um, just the weightiness of existence. The fact that there's so much suffering and harm and evil in the world. The fact that there's just so much we don't know, and the possibility, or maybe even the likelihood, that all of this matters much more than we could ever imagine, and that we're not, living up to what we should be living up to. We're not doing what we're supposed to be doing. We're falling short. That's pretty heavy. Um, and then the light, you said. I think it's related to the darkness, right? Like I think oftentimes peak experiences, um, have a mix of both, right? Like you go through the dark night of the soul, and then you experience a joy or a lightness, that you never thought was possible. Let alone when you were comfortably numb, but when you were suddenly really having a crisis in your life, in your situation or psychologically or emotionally, there's certain times where there's certain levels of well-being or joy that you just think, okay, that's not real. That's not something I can ever feel or have access to. And then if and when it does come, and it's just like beyond your, what you could have imagined, and it puts everything into perspective, and it creates an outpouring of love to everybody that's important to your life, and love of the world, love of the universe, love of God, right? Just it's I think they're completely tied together.
Hmm. I was just I was just imagining like this mental movie of like you coming through some kind of dark night of the soul, and then maybe like imagining that the way you saw your children's face or your partner's face, like that it had some new context, or some there was like a new experiential, maybe even like unnameable quality to it. And I don't want to put words to your experience, but just that's kind of the image that came to mind of like how those close relationships like can take on like a new kind of like aspect, depending, or as the result of kind of having that experience of light, and possibly even out
Mm.
of an experience of darkness.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I don't know if I don't know if I would have thought of it that way, but I think maybe one definition of love, or somebody that's really important to you, is you're continually seeing them in a new light. They're continually challenging you, and then you're seeing them and your relationship with them, um, and its importance in a new way. And it causes both grief and joy. Grief that you didn't see it before, and you've maybe not, done them service. You maybe not, you know, allowed them to be, you know, um, what they can be, or like your energy has been blocking them or something of that nature. And so grief at like, your ignorance, and then, but also hope and joy at, how important that is, and how you want to change, how you want to grow with them, in relationship with them. And so that's a very hard, but it's also, it's meaningful.
Yeah, as I mean, you summarized it when you said like relationships are important.
Yeah. And I think that's, that's probably, you know, the answer to many of the questions that we've been exploring tonight, right? Like, what is localism? Well, localism is just a set of relationships, that you're prioritizing, either with other people, with other animals, with a larger, ecology. Um, at the end of the day, even like these new ways of living, experiments in living, um, how do they spread? How do these things get taken up? It's through transfer. It's through teaching. It's through sharing, with other people. It's giving your time to teach other people things, and learning. It's all about relationships, I think, at the end of the day.
And our body is just a myriad of 100 billion relationships between
Right.
cells,
Yeah.
just all jamming along.
Yeah. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, I know it's probably getting towards the end of our our time together. I didn't even introduce you or introduce myself when we started the podcast.
They can see our names. They can see the
Yeah, us.
the title. Which platform is coming on?
Anything that you want to say to conclude the conversation, the
Well,
episode?
well, one, I appreciate how you started it related to that. I appreciate that we kind of just started talking and we didn't have to, do a formal introduction. That was cool. But I appreciate you taking interest in this little, this little niche scene that we've been a part of. It's cool that, it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? I don't know. It's very, why can't I think of the word? I wish I could just like share the feeling that I have without expressing it in a word.
Oh yeah, push the button next on your MacBook, the
There
share
we go.
feels
There we
button.
go. Yeah. Can I do that? No, it's
Yeah.
just very lovely. It's very lovely that you took an interest in what we're doing and you reached out to us to talk to a couple of the hosts. I think it's cool. Yeah, maybe can I ask you what prompted you to do that?
Sure. I think the the main answer would be, oh, my dog is ripping up a blanket to smithereens. Um, I maybe not the vain answer. The selfish answer is that I love asking people questions and I wanted to interview people, and I felt that like interviewing you folks, that there wouldn't be this context of like kind of what I call pseudo professionalism. Um, that there could be a chance to just have the conversation without doing like a pre kind of conversation, so to speak. Um, and then I think also to that I think that there was a way that I wanted to feel like more connected to like the vibe that I got from Doomer Optimism was that like that it really did include me, and that it wasn't about some sort of like space where only sort of experts are allowed to like inhabit, or only their voices count. That's been sort of the most inspiring thing for me about Doomer Optimism, is the sense that like everybody matters. Um, and I think, and then in hindsight, I think what I really love is like the enriching of context, and that I love the idea that perhaps someone listening to like your episode here or Ashley's episode, that it will sort of have another contextual element that will relate to like the all of the episodes that you've recorded, both you and Ashley. And something about that just really, I think, getting a sense of like who you are as people, like in all the ways that you're people, is really wonderful to me. And so that's sort of where I am in this moment.
Nice.
And just like you said, maybe maybe after this I'll think about 10 other things. And but
Yeah. Well, it was, it's a really cool idea, that you want to do this. And, it's great having you kind of part of this ecosystem now. You're a certified host twice, right? You didn't even have to go through
yeah.
the barrier of being a guest first. You're a certified host. Oh, it's
Aha.
clever. It's clever. Appeal to our vanity. It's like, oh, they want to interview me. So that was very good. And yeah, I just welcome you to, if you want to have more conversation in this space with other hosts or just other potential guests that you're interested in, you're welcome to. You're part of the club now.
Well, let's toast a digital beer or cider or wine or H2O and to be continued.
Definitely. Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Cool, man. And we should talk more offline sometime too. If you just wanna chat
Okay.
sometime, talk about whatever. Um,
Cynicism. How do you overcome it?
nice. All right. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna leave the call on here just so I can make sure that I close
Okay.
out properly and I have the files to
Okay.
send you here. But on your end, you're all set
Okay.
here,
So I
right?
could close the browser and it'll be fine.
Yes, you'll
Okay.
be
Cool.
okay.
I'll send you a link to the Dropbox that you should put it in. It's just a personal email, Dropbox. Yeah.
Okay, sounds
Cool, man.
sounds excellent.
Till next time. Take
Okay,
care.
bye
Bye.
bye.